There is an experiment that has been repeated in laboratories around the world for over 100 years, conducted by serious physicists with precise equipment and published in the most respected scientific journals on the planet. And the result of this experiment remains, to this day, the most disturbing piece of data that science has ever produced about the nature of reality. The experiment is called the double-slit experiment, and what it showed is that subatomic particles, the fundamental building blocks of all matter that exists, including your body, this screen, the air you breathe, behave in completely different ways depending on whether they are being observed or not. When no one is measuring, the particle behaves like a wave. It exists in multiple places at the same time. It passes through both slits simultaneously. It is, literally, a cloud of coexisting possibilities. The instant a measuring instrument is installed to record which slit it passes through, the cloud collapses. The particle ceases to be a possibility and becomes a fact, a specific point in space, a concrete reality. Observation creates reality. This is not metaphor, this is not speculative philosophy. It is the most replicated experimental result in modern physics. And the question that physicists have spent decades trying not to ask, because the implications are too uncomfortable, is this: what exactly is observer consciousness? And what happens when this principle applies not to particles in a laboratory, but to the entire life of a human being? Because if observation collapses possibilities into reality at the subatomic level, and if you are observing the world around you every second of every day, then you are, at this very moment, collapsing possibilities into reality, continuously, without stopping. The question is, what kind of observation are you making? Most people, when they hear about consciousness and reality, think of positive thinking, of visualization, of affirmations, of trying to think good thoughts to attract good things. And here's where almost everyone gets lost. Because the consciousness that collapses reality isn't that. It's not the consciousness you mobilize when you're deliberately trying to manifest. It's not the intention you hold for 20 minutes during morning meditation. It is the consciousness that operates when you are not paying attention to it. It's the set of deep-seated expectations your nervous system holds about what's possible for you, about what the world will do when you try something, about whether you're the type of person for whom things usually work out or the type for whom they usually go wrong. This awareness is not in your conscious thoughts. It is in your emotional field, in the quality of the internal state that you continuously maintain below the surface while living your ordinary life. And it is this perception that the quantum field reads. It is this perception that determines which possibilities collapse in its direction and which remain as invisible waves that never become its concrete reality. Werner Heisenberg, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, said that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. In other words, the way you approach reality determines what reality reveals to you. Now consider what this means outside the laboratory. The way you approach a business opportunity with confidence or latent anxiety determines what that opportunity reveals to you, the paths it opens or closes, the quality of the interactions it produces. The way you approach a relationship, with openness or with the unconscious expectation that you will disappoint or be disappointed, determines what that relationship becomes. The way you approach any aspect of your life is being shaped, second by second, by a consciousness that most people have never honestly examined. And this is the consciousness that collapses reality, not the one you perform, the one you are. David Bohm, a British physicist who worked directly with Einstein and dedicated decades to studying the implicit order of the universe, proposed that the visible reality we experience is only the surface of a much deeper structure. A coiled order, he called it, from which emerge the events we perceive as concrete. What determines what emerges from this profound order to the surface of your experience? The quality of consciousness you bring to the encounter with it, not the consciousness you choose to have. The consciousness you actually have, the one that's embedded in your nervous system, in your automatic expectations, in the way your body responds before your conscious mind has time to process anything. Because the nervous system responds in milliseconds, long before any conscious thought, and this pre-response state, this posture that your body automatically adopts in the face of life, is the true observer. It is what the field reads. It is what determines the collapse. There is a study conducted by researchers at Harvard University in 2010 that illustrates this concretely. Participants were monitored throughout the day using an app that asked, at random times, what they were doing, what they were thinking, and how they were feeling. The result was that people spent almost half their waking time with their minds somewhere other than what they were doing, thinking about the past, anticipating the future, worrying about situations that weren't happening at that moment. And the crucial finding, this scattered state of mind was strongly correlated with lower levels of well-being, regardless of what people were doing. The activity mattered less than the state of presence with which they performed it, translating to the observer effect. A scattered mind is a fragmented observer, and a fragmented observer produces fragmented collapses. Inconsistent realities, results that arrive partially and dissolve, patterns that repeat themselves without the person understanding why. The awareness that collapses reality in its favor is not intense. It is coherent. It is present. It is the kind of attention that is not divided between what is happening now and the worry scripts that the nervous system insists on reproducing. Nikola Tesla said that to discover the secrets of the universe, one had to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And although he was talking about physics, this observation applies with surgical precision to the workings of human consciousness. Your consciousness has a frequency, not metaphorically, in a measurable electromagnetic way. The human cardiac field, studied by the HeartMath Institute for decades, extends meters beyond the physical body and carries information about an individual's emotional state in a way detectable by measuring instruments. This field constantly transmits to the environment, to the people around it, and according to the implications of the observer effect, to the field of possibilities that determines which realities collapse in its direction. And the frequency of this field is not determined by your conscious thoughts. It is determined by your dominant emotional state, the one that exists in the silence between thoughts, the one that is present when you are not trying to feel anything in particular. This is the real observer, and it is the consciousness that collapses reality, not the one you imagine you have, the one you truly are. In the following parts of this video, we're going to go to exactly where this becomes transformative, to how you begin to access your true observer, to what's at the base of your emotional frequency that's still collapsing realities you no longer want, and to what changes when you finally learn to be the kind of consciousness that the field can't ignore. There's a question that very few people honestly ask themselves during a journey of personal transformation, and the absence of this question is precisely what keeps most people stuck in the same patterns, even after years of study, practice, and disciplined application of techniques. The question is this: what is the consciousness that I truly possess? Not the one I practice, not the one I aspire to have, but the one that operates automatically in my nervous system before any conscious choice. Because there is a fundamental difference between the consciousness you mobilize when you are deliberately doing inner work and the consciousness that operates when you are simply living. And it is the latter that determines the collapse. Antonio Damasio, a Portuguese neuroscientist who has dedicated decades to studying the relationship between emotion and cognition, has demonstrated something that should completely change the way we think about human behavior. Emotions are not just reactions to what happens, they are maps, navigation systems that the brain uses to make decisions, assess situations, and predict what will happen next. And these maps are built throughout life from repeated experiences, from patterns that the nervous system has learned to recognize as true about how the world works and what you can expect from it. The problem is that these maps are constructed too early, in contexts that often no longer have any relation to their current life, by a nervous system that was not yet mature enough to fully process what it was experiencing. Joe Dispenza accurately describes this in his work on neuroplasticity and conscious creation. He uses the image of a computer running old programs. The screen may be new, the processor may be faster, but if the operating system is still 20 years old, the new programs cannot run as they should. You may have acquired new knowledge. You may have done therapy, courses, retreats. You may have changed observable behaviors. But if the deep emotional map, the automatic expectation of the nervous system about what you can receive from the world, remains the same, the observer remains the same. And the collapse, as a natural consequence, produces variations of the same pattern with different external scenarios. And they continue to operate, silently, automatically, determining what their observer transmits to the field, regardless of what you consciously want to create. A person who grew up in an environment where resources were scarce not only thinks that money is hard to come by, they feel it in their body. They expect it. And this somatic expectation, this automatic anticipation of the nervous system, is transmitted to the electromagnetic field of the heart as a signal that the quantum field receives with mathematical precision. Not as punishment, as a mirror. The field has no agenda. It simply responds to what it finds. Here's something worth examining with all the honesty you can muster. Think of a result you want to create that hasn't yet materialized. A specific, concrete result. Something you've tried to create in many different ways, and that remains out of reach. Now, before thinking about the outcome, just feel it. What happens in your body when you think about it? Is there an expansion, an opening? The tranquil feeling that it's on its way, that it's natural, that it corresponds to who you are? Or is there a contraction, a familiar weight, an internal narrative that begins to list reasons why it might not work this time either? A subtle urgency that carries within it the frequency of someone who is still waiting, still trying, still hasn't arrived. This somatic response, this reaction that occurs in the body before any conscious thought is formed, is your real observer. It is the signal you are transmitting. And it is exactly the kind of collapse that this signal produces, not because you are incapable, because the map your nervous system is using to navigate toward that outcome is still drawn from an old territory. Max Planck, in introducing quantum theory in 1900, demonstrated that energy does not manifest continuously, but in discrete units that need to reach a specific threshold to produce an effect. Below this threshold, nothing changes. At the exact threshold, the transition occurs abruptly. Consciousness functions in an analogous way. An emotional frequency visited occasionally does not produce consistent collapse. A frequency that does not reach the threshold of real incorporation, of presence in the nervous system as a recognizable and familiar state, remains only an aspiration, an intention that the field cannot yet read as a dominant signal. This explains why so many techniques work temporarily and then stop, why results appear and disappear, why the same pattern reconstructs itself in slightly different but structurally identical ways. The frequency was visited, but it wasn't incorporated. And incorporation doesn't happen through mental effort. It happens through deep emotional repetition, through genuine, unperformed moments of inhabiting a different frequency, of allowing the nervous system to recognize it as familiar, as belonging to you. The Tibetan monks whom Richard Davidson studied at the University of Wisconsin starting in the 1990s spent decades developing precisely this capacity. Not the capacity to think different thoughts. The capacity to inhabit different emotional states so deeply and consistently that these states became the default setting of the nervous system. The electroencephalograms showed something researchers had never seen before: gamma waves of unprecedented amplitude and consistency in the scientific literature. These waves indicated neural integration, a coherence between different brain regions, producing enhanced perception, extraordinary clarity, and a quality of presence that instruments could measure but could hardly explain within available models. What these monks had that most people don't have is not talent, it's practice. Decades of consistent return to specific inner states until those states ceased to be practices and became identity. And this identity, this deep configuration of the nervous system, is what the observer determines when it collapses. So the central question is not, how do I change my thoughts? The question is, how do I change the observer? How do I change the consciousness that operates below the level of conscious thought, in the territory of the automatic nervous system, of somatic expectations, of the emotional frequencies that the field is actually reading? There is no intellectual answer to this. There is an experiential answer. You begin by observing, not what you think, what you feel, and not what you feel when you are paying attention, what you feel when you are not. What is the emotional tone of your day when no one is watching and you're not trying to feel anything in particular? What is the quality of attention you bring to everyday situations? What is the automatic expectation of your nervous system when something new and potentially good comes along? These observations cannot be made effectively by the analytical mind. They require a different kind of attention. An attention that observes without immediately analyzing, concluding, and trying to correct. An attention that allows the pattern to be seen clearly before the urgency to change it obscures it again. Here's what this honest observation makes possible. When an emotional pattern is seen clearly enough, without judgment, without the impulse to suppress it or to identify completely with it, it begins to lose its automatic charge. Not because it was fought against, because it was illuminated. Consciousness, when applied with genuine presence, has a natural property of transforming what it observes. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in a real and progressive way. And as the pattern loses charge, the space it occupied opens up. The nervous system begins to have availability for a different frequency, to inhabit, even if briefly, even if imperfectly, the emotional state that corresponds to the reality you want to create. This dwelling, however brief, however partial, is the beginning of a change in the observer. It is the start of building a new internal architecture, one that the quantum field will begin to read differently. And when the field interprets things differently, the collapse changes, with a speed that, for those experiencing it from the outside, seems impossible to explain. In the next part, we'll talk about how this translates into concrete practice, about the actual steps to building an observer who consistently collapses the desired reality, and about what happens on this journey that most people aren't prepared to face, and how to navigate it without losing the signal. You already understand the mechanism. The consciousness that collapses reality is not the one you perform during intentional practices. It's the one that operates automatically in your nervous system. It's the emotional field that your heart continuously transmits to the environment. It's the observer that the quantum field actually reads. And you've probably already made the honest observation. You've recognized the frequency you're transmitting. Perhaps you've felt the discomfort of clearly seeing the distance between where your nervous system actually is and where you want to be. Now comes the part that separates those who truly transform from those who continue studying transformation indefinitely. The construction of the observer. The first element of this construction is what I call presence before reaction. The automatic nervous system responds in milliseconds. A situation occurs, a stimulus arrives, and before any conscious thought can form, the old observer is already operating. It is already collapsing reality from the old map. Presence before reaction is the practice of inserting a space between the stimulus and the response, a fraction of a second of awareness that interrupts the automatic response enough to allow a different choice to become possible. Not a forced choice. A pause. A breath. A moment to notice what is happening internally before reacting externally. This space seems small, but it's the space where the observer can be different, where instead of responding from the old map, you can, even if briefly, inhabit a frequency more coherent with the reality you want to create. With repetition, this space expands. What began as a fraction of a second becomes seconds. What was a conscious effort becomes a capability that the nervous system begins to incorporate as an available option. This isn't willpower, it's targeted neuroplasticity. Every time you enter the space, every time you pause before reacting, and choose a response different from the automatic one, you are strengthening a neural circuit that competes with the old pattern circuit. Over time, and with consistency, the new circuit becomes stronger. The space expands on its own, and the observer operating within that space begins to be you more often than not. The second element is frequency anchoring. There is a crucial distinction between visiting an emotional frequency and anchoring it. You visit it when you feel it during meditation and then leave it. You anchor it when you repeat it with enough consistency and depth that the nervous system begins to recognize it as familiar. The practical application is simple, but it requires honesty about the quality of presence you bring to it. It's not about visualizing the desired outcome. It's about genuinely somatically feeling the emotional frequency of the version of yourself that already has that outcome as a natural part of your life. How it breathes, how it inhabits its own body, the quality of attention with which it relates to the world around it, the absence of urgency, the presence of a quiet certainty that doesn't need to be defended because it is simply true. Dwelling at that frequency for 60, 90 seconds with real presence is worth more than an hour of performance without depth. Because the nervous system doesn't register duration, it registers intensity of presence. And when that frequency begins to become familiar, when the nervous system begins to recognize it as a state that belongs to you, the observer you project onto the field begins to change, gradually, progressively, so that the collapse begins to reflect this new configuration. The third element is the most counterintuitive and therefore the most frequently overlooked. It's about consistency in ordinary moments. Most people practice mindfulness during formal moments, morning meditation, visualization before bed, and then they live the rest of the day on autopilot, reacting to everyday situations from the standard observer perspective. But the field doesn't differentiate between formal and ordinary moments. It reads continuous frequency, and ordinary moments add up to infinitely more time than formal ones. This means that every micro moment of the day is an opportunity to build or dismantle the observer you are trying to stabilize. Every response to a difficult message, every decision made under pressure, every moment when a situation activates the old pattern and you have the option to deliberately return to the frequency you want to embody. These micro-choices accumulate. They build the coherence that the nervous system needs to register the new observer as a real identity, not as an occasional practice. I need to talk to you about something that almost no content on consciousness and manifestation openly mentions. Because it's precisely at this point in the journey that most people get stuck. Not because of a lack of understanding, not because of a lack of effort, but because there was a lack of structure for the moments when the old pattern of the nervous system takes over again. And it will take over again, especially when life presents situations that directly activate the old map. When external reality has not yet changed, and the new observer is being constructed without any external confirmation that it is working. In these moments, the ego presents perfectly logical arguments for reverting to the known pattern. And without a clear map of what is happening and how to navigate it, most people retreat. That's why I created the Surrender Code. This is not a manifestation method promising results in 30 days. It is an honest and structured guide for people who understand what we are talking about here, who recognize each principle, who resonate with the depth of this work, but who consistently get stuck in the space between understanding and incorporating. The Surrender Code shows you how to navigate the moments when the old observer tries to regain control, how to recognize the pattern before it has already collapsed, how to build the consistency that the nervous system needs to register a new frequency as its true identity. The link is in the first pinned comment below. No rush, no pressure. But if you're tired of understanding and continuing to see the same patterns, perhaps this is exactly what you were missing for what you already know to finally become what you live. Returning to the construction of the observer. There is one aspect that Eric Kandel, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2000, made scientifically clear. The brain reorganizes itself based on emotional repetition, not repetition of thoughts, repetition of states. When you frequently repeat an emotional state, the brain strengthens the circuits that support that state. They become the neural pathway of least resistance, the default state to which the nervous system reverts when there is no contrary instruction. This means that the observer's construction is literally a neural reconstruction, a reconfiguration of the circuits that determine what your nervous system expects, anticipates, and transmits to the field. And this reconstruction doesn't require decades, like it does for Tibetan monks. It requires consistency and quality of presence. It requires you to return to the frequency you want to incorporate repeatedly, with real, not mechanical attention, until the nervous system begins to recognize it as familiar. There's a sign that indicates the construction is progressing, and it's rarely what people expect. It's not that external results are starting to appear, at least not first. The first sign is internal. The old pattern begins to lose volume. The inner voice that lists the reasons why it won't work is still present, but it no longer has the same weight. The urgency that accompanied thinking about the desired outcome begins to soften. The tension of needing something to happen begins to give way to a different quality of expectation, an expectation that is not anxious, that is not constantly checking if the field is responding. That does not need external confirmation to sustain itself. This shift in internal quality, subtle as it seems, is the shift in the observer. It is the nervous system learning to inhabit a different frequency. And when this stabilizes, when this quality begins to be the default response instead of an occasional achievement, the breakdown changes. The world around you begins to respond in ways that, to an outside observer, seem impossible to explain through linear causal logic. People you needed to meet appear without you having sought them out. Resources appear before you've even finished formulating your request. Situations that seemed blocked rearrange themselves in ways that no strategy could have forced. This is no coincidence. It's coherence. It's the field responding to the observer you've become, with the same mathematical precision with which it has always responded, but now mirroring a different consciousness, with a speed that, viewed from the outside, seems impossible to explain, because the field has no latency. It responds to the present state, and when the present state genuinely changes, the collapsing reality changes with it. We've reached the deepest level of what we're exploring, the level where the consciousness that collapses reality ceases to be a principle to be applied and simply becomes who you are. Ancient mystics called it realization. Modern consciousness researchers call it systemic coherence. Joe Dispenza, who has dedicated decades to investigating the impact of coherent thought on the nervous system, calls it a state of creation. Different names for the same fundamental transition. The moment when the observer you deliberately constructed ceases to be a practice and becomes an identity. Hugh Everett, a Princeton physicist who in 1957 proposed the theory of multiple worlds, suggested that every possibility that exists in the quantum field not only could become real, it is real, in some branch of reality. What determines which branch manifests in one's experience is the observer's consciousness. It's not a comfortable idea, because it implies something that very few people are truly willing to sit with, that the reality you are living now is, at some deep level, an expression of the consciousness you have brought into the field, not as punishment, not as a result of merit or lack thereof, but as a mathematical consequence of coherence. The field mirrors the observer with a precision that defies any narrative of victimization or arbitrary favoritism. And this, when truly understood and not just intellectually, does not generate guilt. It generates power. The understanding that if the present consciousness created the present reality, a different consciousness can create a different reality. But here's where most people get lost, because this understanding, if poorly assimilated, creates a specific trap. The trap of trying to have a different consciousness, because trying implies effort, and effort is a frequency that tells the field that you are not yet the observer you are trying to be, that you are still outside the state you want to inhabit, looking inward and striving to get in. And the field reads exactly that, the frequency of still trying, of not yet arrived, of still needs to prove they deserve it. Systemic coherence is not a state you achieve through effort. It's a state that emerges when the effort to try to be different is abandoned in favor of simply being. With the current awareness you have, with the frequency you genuinely manage to sustain now, not the frequency you aspire to have tomorrow. This paradox, which sounds like a play on words but is a precise practical instruction, is at the heart of all real transformation. You don't become the observer who collapses the desired reality by trying to be different from what you are. You become that observer by fully accepting what is now, including the old patterns, including the frequencies that don't yet correspond to what you want to create, including the distance between where you are and where you want to be. And in this complete acceptance, without resistance, without the urgency to be different, something begins to change. Because resistance to the old pattern was part of the pattern. And when resistance ceases, the pattern loses the energy that sustained it. Yogananda, who brought the teachings of Vedanta to the West in 1920 and dedicated decades to exploring the relationship between inner consciousness and external reality, described this process as the dissolution of obstacles, not the attainment of a higher state through force, the revelation of what has always been present beneath the layers of conditioning. The observer you are building is not something you are creating from scratch. It is something you are clearing away. The clear, coherent awareness, capable of collapsing reality in your favor, already exists within you. It was simply covered by patterns that, with honest attention and real presence, progressively lose the burden that sustained them. I'll give you a concrete image to help you internalize this. Imagine your emotional field as a lake. The state you want to inhabit is a calm, clear surface. And every time an old pattern emerges, every time anxiety or doubt or urgency appears, it's like a stone thrown onto the surface. The water becomes agitated. Most people, when the stone is thrown, try to force the surface to be calm. They try to suppress the agitation. They try to perform tranquility while underneath the disturbance continues. The conscious observer does something different. He observes the agitation without resisting. He knows that the surface will stabilize on its own if it is not disturbed by resistance, that the waves dissipate naturally when they no longer receive energy. This quality of observation, which allows the pattern to be without identifying with it, which neither fights against the old frequency nor feeds it with resistance, is what allows a new frequency to establish itself as a foundation. Not because of the strength to replace the old one, but because of the lightness of no longer having to support it with resistance. Greg Braden, a researcher who has spent decades exploring the intersection between science and spirituality, describes the field as a mirror that responds to the inner state with a fidelity that admits no exceptions. Not to the state you want to have, to the state you have. And the most transformative implication of this, when truly assimilated, is that there is nothing to be done to change what the field reflects, except to change the internal state. Not the circumstances, not others, not external conditions. The internal state, the observer. And the way to change the internal state is not to force it. It is to understand it deeply enough so that it reorganizes itself naturally. It is to create the internal conditions where the desired frequency can emerge not as performance, but as genuine expression. This takes time, not an arbitrary amount of time. The time the nervous system needs to rebuild the circuits that sustain a new frequency as a pattern. And that time is dramatically shortened by the quality of presence you bring to the practice. There is one last principle I want to leave you with, one that summarizes everything we've discussed and points to something that goes beyond any technique. The most powerful observer is not the one who best controls their emotional states. It's not the one who never feels the old pattern emerge. It's not the one who has a flawless practice that never fails. This refers to someone who has developed such familiarity with their own frequency that returning to a coherent state has become more natural than remaining in the old pattern. That no longer needs to constantly monitor if it's vibrating correctly. That no longer needs to check if the field is responding. That no longer needs external confirmation to sustain the internal state. Because he simply is, consistently, progressively, naturally, the consciousness he wants to radiate. And in this state, the collapse happens with the speed that the thumbnail of this video suggests, with a speed that seems impossible to those still outside the mechanism. But that is simply what happens when the observer and the field finally speak the same language. Bob Proctor used to say that the universe is a source of infinite intelligence that responds to the vibration of whoever accesses it. Not with favoritism, with perfect coherence. Carl Jung, in developing the concept of synchronicity, observed that when someone aligns with their deepest nature, the world around them begins to organize itself in ways that defy linear causal logic. Not because physics ceases to function, because there is a deeper physics at work, one that classical mechanics cannot describe, but that quantum mechanics is beginning to map. This deeper physics is what you are learning to inhabit, not through more knowledge, through a different observer. A consciousness that is not the one you imagine you have, but the one you are, moment by moment, building, embodying, making real. By stepping away from this video, the invitation isn't for you to apply more techniques. It's for you to ask a question and sit with it for as long as it needs to reveal an honest answer. What is the consciousness I truly possess? Not the one I practice, the one that operates, the one the field is reading right now, the one that is determining which possibilities collapse toward me and which remain as waves that never become my reality. When you have the honesty to answer that, you have the map. And when you have the map, you have the path, not a path of striving towards a better version of yourself, a path of returning to the awareness that you already are, beneath everything that has been superimposed by conditioning, by inherited expectations, by maps built in contexts that no longer exist. This return is gradual, it's progressive, it's made up of small moments of conscious choice that accumulate into something that, looking back, seems like an impossible transformation to have happened so completely. But experienced from within, it has the quality of recognition, of something that has always been here, waiting to be seen clearly enough to emerge. This is the consciousness that collapses reality, and it's not the one you imagine, it's the one you finally stop trying to have and simply become. If something within you recognized a truth here, leave it in the comments. I am the observer. As a landmark, as a declaration of a responsibility you are choosing to assume. And if you want a structured path to transform this understanding into consistent practice, the surrender code is available in the first pinned comment. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because each video here is a frequency, and the right frequency, found at the right time, changes everything. Until next time, or until the moment you realize you were always the observer, you were just observing from the wrong spot.